Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Right here I've got what appears to the untrained eye to be a normal 9130 Mosin Nagant. You've probably seen hundreds or thousands of rifles that look just like this, but this guy's a little bit different because this one, unlike a lot of them that are from World War II, is actually 127 years old at the time of making this video. Now that's almost as old as my parents, and it's old enough to give this gun an interesting quirk about its history, because this particular 9130, because of its age, has actually gone through not one but 3 different rear sights in its life. Now that's crazy and almost bordering Craig Jorgensen territory for, well, just wackiness in general. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at this gun, and then we'll get a better idea of the lineage of the rear sights that this guy has had throughout its 127 years of, well, existence in some not very good places. So let's get to it. Alright, so first things first, we can take a look here at we got our big O import marking PW arms. Pretty common to see an import marking like this on most refurbishments out there. To varying degrees of invasiveness, this is sort of on the upper end of that, but that's okay because that's pretty common. Now right away, this is already different from our standard 9130, because if I zoom in a little bit, we can see right here, that is our old Imperial Russia Proof Commission crest with the 2-headed eagle. It is worth noting that's kind of strange because that was never defaced. So for whatever reason, when this gun was refurbished, and up until then, that crest was never removed by the communists. So that's a really noisy bird. Hello, friend. Anyway, that's just kind of worth noting. Now, I don't think it's particular to this one because I have seen some other guns like this, and we'll talk about more about this, but I've seen guns like this particular gun that are really old, like this one's from 1895. And they all seem to still have these markings intact. So how these markings are still intact is an interesting question, probably a good topic for another video, because that could go down an interesting rabbit hole. We can see we got a lot of pitting, quite a lot of character on this guy. And I like that because that means this guy was well used, and I would expect really nothing less from a Mosin that's 127 years old. So we got our Izhevsk bow and arrow. So this is the old Izhevsk factory logo, used up until 1928. And we've got our box marking here, which indicates this guy was refurbished in the modern day location of Riga, Latvia. And that would be Arsenal number 7 in the Soviet Union. Remember, Latvia was part of the Soviet Union. And of course, we have Izhevsk, and this is Oruzheny, which is weapons, and then Zavat, which is factory. So Izhevsk Weapons Factory, 1895. We got our serial number there. And since this, of course, is a 9130 rifle, we have our typical 9130 rear sight. So we have the really old Imperial Russia with the new 9130 rear sight. So it appears that this gun is in fact an old Dragoon rifle that was then converted. I'm going to say most likely this was converted post-war, but again, that's sort of a topic for another video, to the 9130 configuration. Now remember, other than the rear sight, the old Dragoons and the newer 9130s were pretty much the same. The barrel length was practically identical. The stock was very similar and really identical in some cases. The big difference was the sight base, the rear sight base, which is this whole chunk here, the rear sight itself, which is this part, and then the other thing, of course, is going to be the front sight. That is a 9130 front sight. Although the sight base here, we'll see, is actually the original sight base to this gun, and they didn't really have to modify it as far as we know. Let me go get my holder here that fell. As far as we know, the sight base actually stayed the same for the conversion, so you could actually put an original Dragoon front sight on this guy if you wanted to, but the 9130 sights are fine, and I'm going to keep this gun original to its current proper configuration, which is, of course, the 9130 configuration. But just on another tangent, a lot of times you will see blade-style front sights on 9130s from the Spanish Civil War, even though those should have had the... some of those probably should have had the newer style rear sight. So they are interchangeable. Okay, so again, what we've determined here is we have an old 127-year-old Dragoon rifle that was probably converted post-war, and they replaced the front sight. They replaced the rear sight base, which is the big thing, because it sits on here with a dovetail that's part of the barrel. So they drove that off, put the new sight base on, and then put this on. So this sight is actually the third sight in this guy's iteration. Now, technically, this could be an M91. This could have been an M91 rifle, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole as well, because that's a whole nother can of worms were M91 rifles modified to 9130 rifles and shortened. That's another interesting topic for another day. But for this particular one, we kind of know this is a Dragoon because in 1895, it's actually much easier to find a Dragoon because a lot more Dragoons were made in 1895 by the Ijev's factory than M91 rifles. An M91 rifle made in 1895 is actually rare. They didn't make very many of them. Okay, all of those weird tangents avoided as best we can. Let's start to look at the actual different rear sights this guy had, because it gets very interesting. So, let me set this guy here. Now, we're going to go back to this guy's inception in 1895 when this guy was built. What rear sight did he have? Well, he actually had this. This is the original Mosin Nagant style flat rear sight. Now, this particular one is a Tula, so this would not have been on a Dragoon rifle. This would have been on an M91 rifle, but should basically be exactly the same sight otherwise. We can see here, this is a really simple setup. It's just these two pieces of steel going back, and they're connected. There's a bridge here at the back, and then there's a bridge at the front here with the actual sight notch right here. So that's your actual notch. You know, it's not the worst thing in the world. I kind of like the sight picture you get on this with the notch and the little post front sight, but you know, it's got its problems. These weren't particularly stable. They had a propensity to be quite wobbly. As you can see, there's really no support here. They would just sit on they would have a little pin that would sit on the sight base there. So if you got one that wasn't super large diameter pin, it was really easy to have it just wobble around like that. But these were used from the Mosin Nagant's inception in 1891 on the Dragoon rifle, the M91 rifle, and the Cossack rifle. Now, the Dragoon rifle was introduced in 1893, and the Cossack rifle was introduced in 1894. But this sight would have been used on all those models up through the Russo-Japanese War, and then all the way until they changed cartridges, and then a little bit after that. So this sight was used, and then in 1908, remember, that's when the Soviets, or not the Soviets, I'm in the wrong time period, Imperial Russia decided that they needed to modernize with a new Spitzer cartridge, because up until now, the cartridge they'd been using with this rear sight was a big bottle-nosed cartridge, kind of like a modern-day hunting soft point round, but it was a lot longer, much more pronounced bottle nose, and it wasn't a soft point. It would have been just like a full metal jacket, essentially. A lot of those were Cooper nickel, although I don't know if that's particularly what the Russians liked, but that was sort of an older style. Anyway, with this rear sight, though, they had a bit of a problem with a new Spitzer cartridge. So they started out trying this rear sight with a new Spitzer cartridge, and they found that the Spitzer cartridge was great because it added a lot of velocity to the round, and it gave you a greater point-blank range, which is the range where you're aiming at and the bullet will actually hit, right? Because eventually when you fire your bullet, after a certain distance, gravity is going to start pulling it down to the ground. So the part at which it now starts to do that, the distance from the muzzle to that point is going to be your point blank range, if that makes sense. Basically, the range, you don't have to modify your sight distance to offset it, essentially. A whole lot, at least. So that was a great thing about the Spitzer cartridge, but unfortunately, the Spitzer cartridge had, as you can imagine, because of this, had much different ballistic properties than the bottlenose. And with this rear sight, they found accuracy to be simply intolerable. Because remember, this sight was designed for a totally, not just a little bit different, a totally different cartridge with totally different ballistic properties. And especially at different ranges, you're going to get a lot of different outcomes with the old versus the new cartridge. So this obviously had a lot of problems. Now, this one's interesting. If you look on the back here, this is ranged in arshins, which is essentially like a pace, old Imperial Russian unit of measurement. This one would go all the way up to 2,700. This is weird because you got 25, 27, 26 here in line. So it looks like this notch here is 2,500 arshins. This notch up here is 2,600 arshins. And then notice there's another notch here. Well, that's because you use this notch, but then when you have the volley sight up like this, you have this notch all the way up here at the top for 2,700 meters. That, folks, is quite frankly an egregiously long distance that you probably couldn't hit the broadside of a barn at that distance, but as a joke, if nothing else, it is on here. And it's sort of cool because these sights are incredibly rare. So it's really cool to be able to take a closer look at one with y'all. Now, remember I said we were having problems with these. So what was the solution? To change the cartridge? To modify the cartridge, maybe reduce its ballistic capabilities to work with the old sight? No. We need a new sight. And thankfully, we had a worker at the Sestrorets arms factory by the name of Konovalov come up with a new design, which is this guy. And you're probably a lot more familiar with this because this is a much more common rear sight than this guy. Because practically all of these were converted to this. So if you could find one that's not converted to this, that is crazy rare. So we can see here, this guy's got our old Ijev's factory logo. And this one's interesting because it's marked KAV. That's actually going to be a topic for another video, but just understand that. KAV. Probably short for cavalry, because B is V is in Victor in Russian. But again, topic for another video. We've dodged like 5 different video topics already, guys. I'm trying to keep us on track here. So we can see this guy, if we look at the volley sights. So this is pretty cool. We now have this little notch that we would use. So remember on this guy, you would also have you'd have another notch here on the slider. So there's really 3 notches on the old style. There's one there, and one there, right? 3 notches. That's kind of crazy. But you have the same thing here, but this slider is pretty nice. I prefer this slider because you have 2 springs, as we'd say in Arkansas. They would hold it one on each side to give it pressure. These are way more secure than these. Now, granted, this one was in a fire, so the spring lost most of its springiness on it, but these really... I've also tried one of these on one that wasn't in a fire, and I'll tell you, these are not the most secure thing in the world, because the only thing that's securing this slider to the actual spring body itself is there's a little spring in this right side here, and there's a little screw, and the screw is sort of supposed to keep tension against the spring on the body. Not the greatest design in the world, honestly. This one is way better. In fact, I actually have a hard time even moving this. These really stood the test of time, though, because these are really, most of these are really old at this point, and these things are built like a tank. I mean, this weighs a lot more than this. And we can also see here at the front, these still have some problems with notoriously being a little bit wobbly, but these are a little bit better because, see, they have reinforcements here on the sides, whereas this guy just has that main body, but he doesn't have the side reinforcements. So around 1909, it seems, is when we first started to see the sights for the new bullet come out. So about around a year later-ish. It's really fuzzy, folks. We would also see that. I mean, it was weird because even the 1907 carbine, which we're not really talking about today, originally, which came out right when the Spitzer did, it seems like even in early 1909, from examples that I've seen, they actually were still making sights graduated for the old bottlenose cartridge in 1909. So, you know, it's not like 100% when, or we're not 100% sure when they did the adoption, but also it wasn't like 100%, all right, overnight, we're totally adopting it. I mean, it happened in phases because Russia is so big, they got a lot of guns. But I have to say, the little notch back here on the Konovalov rear sight's quite nice. I mean, compare it to the old one here. Kind of a similar picture, and that's good because I that's one of the big pros of this. I like the V-notch, the rear sight picture back here. If you've ever handled like an M91 or a Dragoon rifle that has like the little post front sight and then the little V-notch rear sight, I quite like the sight picture. Probably even more so than the 9130 rifle. These have really nice sight pictures. Now this one, as we can see, because ballistically it was better ballistics, we now can go from 2,700 Arshins to 3,200 Arshins. And really, you could even go past that. You could go up a little bit more, even though there's not another stop. So your stops, this is sort of weird how this sight works. You have these little notches here on the top. Well, these are your stops. So it's kind of hard to see there. See that little guy? That's what's actually setting into this recess here in these stops. So there's a spring holding it in there, and when I push this button in, it's pushing that guy out so then I can move it freely. And then when I let the button go, it's going to go back into the stop there. So again, much more secure. You don't have anything like that on here. There's no stops. You just have a spring. Not the greatest design in the world. So just in that respect, this is a much better design. And so it's really easy to understand why it's really hard to find a Mosin that doesn't have one of these, or that does have one of these sights, because they were pretty much all converted because these were no good. As Serbia found out, especially in World War I, because they actually had some guns in World War I with this rear sight, but they had a lot of Spitzer ammo. So they found it rather repulsive that they had to use the old bottlenose rear sight with the Spitzer ammo. And it's sort of funny because, you know, a lot of countries, when they converted to Spitzer, they actually changed from, one of the things they had to do was actually slightly modify the chamber dimensions for the new bullet. You had probably just adjusting the throat of the chamber. What's interesting about the Mosin, though, is no adjustments were made to the chamber for the new cartridge. It was only the sight replacement. So it was totally backwards compatible, which was a problem. Because you'd even have cases in World War I where you'd have the old bottlenose ammo. In some places, especially in the Balkans, you'd have old bottlenose ammo with the Konovalov rear sight. I mean, yeah, you would run into all sorts of logistical nightmares like that. But again, we're going down the rabbit hole, folks. 3,200 Arshins, I think that's a little bit optimistic. We can even see there tiny, tiny, tiny little Izhevsk factory bow and arrow there on the left. Tiny. That's really cool. I've never even noticed that. All right. Well, you learn something new every day, folks. I like the way these graduations are machined. It's really cool how they're like close and then they get further away as it goes along. Just a really cool rear sight, and these were pretty successful. They worked well. So they started adopting these around 1909, and these served through World War I all the way up until the 20s. And then around the early 1930s is finally when we would start to see what we would now think of as the 9130. Although it didn't quite happen in 1930. I've even seen examples from 1931 that still have this old style rear sight. So again, it wasn't overnight, folks. It generally took a few years at least. But finally, around 1931-ish, we would go from our Konovalov rear sight to this guy. Now, remember we talked about Dragoon rifles and M91 rifles. Well, the M91 rifles, they really stopped producing those around 1926-ish. And because after World War I, they realized they're so long that the Dragoon rifles are pretty good. So that's really, again, that's why these guns are so similar to Dragoons, the 9130 rifles, because that's really what they're based off of, and why we see a lot of what we would call X-Dragoons. That's right, this is an X-Dragoon, even though generally when we see X-Dragoons, they're from the 1920s. This one is still an X-Dragoon, it's just quite a lot older than that. So again, we'd go from our Konovalov rear sight to this new rear sight. Now again, this one's funny because we're actually kind of going back in time. We're going again from a tangent style sight to this guy, and notice he's sort of curved, so he's got some curvature. And then we're sort of going back to this flat tangent style rear sight again. See, these guys are flat. And what's funny is, this is kind of going back to its roots. Look how similar these sights are. I mean, obviously this one is substantially beefier. This is a better design. But if you look at them, this is a pretty similar design, folks. The same basic, very basic concepts. This little notch here, a slider, and just a flat bar of steel. Now this guy doesn't have the reinforcements on the side. They ditched those because this is one of the good things about 9130s. You don't need it because now you have these big reinforcements that's part of the sight base. And these rear sights have much less play and wobble side to side. So that's a much better design. That's good. That's really what we want. So this guy goes out to 2,000 meters now. And, you know, this one's also interesting because remember the old style volley sights, you'd have your combat sight, and then if you want to switch to volley, you would flip the entire sight up like 90 degrees like that, right? Well, on this guy, you didn't do that. You would just go from the slider, so as you move the slider up, the sight would raise and raise and raise, and then it would go like that, right? So it's simpler in the concepts we're working with here. So this is good. This is a good design. It's very robust. It's simpler, but it's funny because there's actually even several different, albeit minor, variations of this sight. And there's another topic for another video that we can't really go down into today. But again, here is our post-1928 Izhevsk factory logo. So pre-1928. Post-1928. Same manufacturer. Okay, so it's cool. It's sort of like having a Mosin family reunion, right? So you think of all the bad places that this gun has been. It's had 3 different rear sights. So it's like having a family reunion. We went from 1895, this guy, to 1909, 1910-ish, this guy, through World War I, and then either World War II or post-World War II, we got this sight. So 3 different rear sights, 127 years equals one incredibly historic gun, folks. These really old Dragoon rifles are just cool. They have a charm and an interesting collector's market all their own. In fact, if you're ever able to snag an antique 9130 like this guy, I would, because for the prices I've seen these go for lately, it's not been cheap. And here's another topic for another video. Are Dragoon rifles worth more if they're in the original Dragoon state or if they've been converted? Now, that's really not necessarily pertinent to like Dragoons from the 1920s, because obviously those are going to be worth more if they're in the original configuration. But what about something weird and crazy like this, where somehow this really old gun managed to survive all the way past World War II and got converted? These are not very common. So is it more common to find one of these or to find one in its original Dragoon configuration? And again, when I say Dragoon configuration, we're talking about this rear sight, not this rear sight, because this rear sight is crazy. I mean, that's like out of the ballpark. We're really talking about this Canaveral rear sight, because that's really what you would find if you found an original Dragoon. Okay, so I hope y'all didn't get too lost down any one of those rabbit holes you went down, and I hope you enjoyed having another cool Mosin family reunion with our 3 really interesting and widely variant rear sights. Pretty cool, folks. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If y'all like more Mosin Nagant content like this, please consider subscribing. Let me know if y'all got any prayer requests. And we'll see you next time.